He sat alone at the table, quiet, dignified, until the waiter leaned in with a smirk and told him to leave. There was no noise in his response, no outburst, no protest. Just the subtle raise of an eyebrow and the kind of silence that speaks louder than 1,000 words. The restaurant buzzed with crystal glass clinks and soft classical music. But at that table, something deeper stirred. They didn't ask his name. They didn't check the reservation. They saw his skin before they saw his story. He wore a simple denim jacket, silver hair perfectly trimmed, and eyes that carried decades of battles won in silence. They assumed he didn't belong, but when they found out who he really was, the laughter died in their throats. Before we begin, comment where you're watching from, and tell us, have you ever seen someone judged too soon, only to prove everyone wrong? Elijah King didn't walk into the restaurant to make a statement. He walked in to keep a promise. At 68, he carried himself with the quiet strength of a man who had nothing left to prove. His silver hair framed a face lined not by age, but by wisdom, experience, and a lifetime of fighting battles that most men would never survive. He wore a white button-down shirt tucked beneath a faded denim jacket, and on his wrist a worn leather watch that had ticked through marches, negotiations, and victories. The billionaire philanthropist who once led civil rights movements now lived with a quieter purpose, one shaped not by crowds, but by memory. He had lost his wife, Evelyn, exactly 1 year ago. And this restaurant, an upscale French establishment, with gold-rimmed mirrors, polished chandeliers, and a carefully curated guest list, had once been their little escape. It was here that she laughed the loudest, held his hand the softest, and made even the finest cuisine feel like home. Today, he came not to dine, but to honor her birthday, to sit where they once sat, to remember. But from the moment he entered, the air shifted. Behind the smiles of hospitality stood Martin and Olivia, two white servers in their 30s who wore their vests like armor and their entitlement like perfume. Martin narrowed his eyes when Elijah stepped in, and Olivia tilted, her head whispering something behind her menu. To them, this wasn't a man with a story. It was a stranger with the wrong skin, the wrong jacket, the wrong presence. They watched him as if he were a misplaced object, an error in the setting. The restaurant glowed with elegance, but beneath, the linen tablecloths and glimmering brass sconces was a deep undercurrent of exclusion dressed as decorum. Elijah sat calmly, placing his hand on the table where his wife's would have rested, while whispers floated from the server's station like poison. He heard them. He just chose not to respond. Because sometimes dignity isn't shown in what you say, but in what you don't have to. Martin approached the table with a rehearsed smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. His voice had that hollow politeness reserved for those you don't really want to serve. "Sir," he began, tilting, his head slightly, "are you waiting for someone? This area is for reservations only." Elijah looked up slowly, his gaze calm, his tone even. "I have one," he said simply, "under King." Martin blinked, caught slightly off guard, but not enough to consider checking. Before he could respond, Olivia strolled over, her voice tinged with condescension. "That's unlikely," she said, glancing down at the leather-bound reservation book with more theater than necessity. "We're fully booked tonight," Martin added with a smirk. "You sure you're in the right place?" Elijah reached into his pocket and pulled out his ID, sliding it across the linen tablecloth. "I believe so," he replied, still composed, the edge of sorrow hiding behind his grace. Olivia glanced at the ID but didn't even pick it up. She chuckled instead. "We don't do walk-ins, sir," she said, as if that settled it. Around the room, a few heads turned. A couple, seated nearby, exchanged a look. One woman furrowed her brow, sensing something wrong but saying nothing. Most guests continued sipping their wine, not wanting discomfort to disturb their evening. Elijah's face didn't flinch, but in his eyes something dimmed. A familiar ache not from this moment alone, but from a lifetime of being mistaken for less. The weight of it sank into his chest, not heavy enough to break him, but deep enough to bruise. He glanced toward the far corner where he and Evelyn used to sit by the window, the place where she once said, "One day they'll know your name before you even walk in." Martin stepped back with an exaggerated shrug. "Look, it's a busy night. Maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere casual," he said, nodding toward the door with a smug half-smile. Olivia whispered under her breath, "These old guys never get it." And then, as if dismissing a child, they motioned for him to leave. Elijah stood, slow and graceful. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand anything. He simply collected his things, nodded once, and walked out, leaving, behind the table, the judgment and the ignorance that had tried to shrink him. But the moment his footsteps left the polished floor, something unseen shifted. The chandeliers still glowed, the wine still poured, but the ground beneath the restaurant had already started to tremble. And no one, especially not Martin and Olivia, had any idea just how loud the silence they laughed at was about to become. Elijah had barely reached the sidewalk when the restaurant doors swung open behind him. A young hostess, barely in her 20s, rushed out, heels clacking frantically on the pavement. Her face flushed with panic and disbelief. "Mr. King," she called out breathlessly, "we've been expecting you." Elijah turned, his expression still calm, but her urgency brought a faint flicker of surprise to his brow. I'm so sorry," she stammered. "We had the private room ready. There must have been a mistake at the front." Before he could respond, she gently took his arm and guided him back inside, her voice now trembling. "Please, sir, right this way." As the doors closed behind them, the noise in the restaurant shifted. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to lips. Whispers swept through the room like wind curling through tall grass. "Wait a minute. Is that Elijah King?" someone murmured. "The Elijah King? The tech billionaire?" Another echoed, setting down a wine glass. Phones subtly appeared from purses and pockets. Olivia, still wiping down a menu near the bar, froze as the realization rippled toward her. Martin, halfway through a joke to another table, turned pale, his laughter dying on his lips. The manager, stiff, red-faced, and suddenly aware of every pair of eyes in the building, stepped forward, eyes darting between his staff and the man they had just forced out. "Mr. King," the manager began, voice tight with dread, "please, allow me to personally apologize on behalf of the entire staff. There was clearly a grave error." But Elijah held up a hand, not with anger, with grace. "Save your apology for your staff," he said quietly, nodding toward Martin and Olivia, who now stood like schoolchildren awaiting punishment. The manager turned on them, voice sharp and public. "You two are on immediate suspension. We'll discuss further disciplinary—" But Elijah interrupted once more, his voice rising just enough to carry across the restaurant. "No need for theatrics," he said, stepping toward his original table, the one by the window where he and Evelyn used to sit. "I'll stay here. I booked this table for a reason." The hostess moved to guide him toward the private room prepared in his honor, but he declined with a gentle shake of the head. "This one's just fine." He placed his hand on the back of the chair and slowly turned to face the entire restaurant. His words were soft, but they struck like thunder. "You judged me because I looked like your idea of less. You looked at my clothes, my age, and my skin, and decided I didn't belong." A ripple of discomfort moved through the air. Martin looked away. Olivia stared down at her shoes. Elijah continued. "But the irony is, I helped build the world that pays for this roof, the apps on your phones, the servers in your kitchens, the grants that funded the very culinary school your chef trained in." His voice didn't rise, but his presence filled the room. "You wear your service like a bow tie. I wore my dignity in silence." A beat of silence followed, long and thick with meaning. Then he pulled out the chair and sat, calmly unfolding his napkin as though nothing had happened. But everything had. And no one in that room, especially not Martin or Olivia, would ever see that table, that jacket, or that man the same way again. As Elijah sat at the table, the sun dipping low behind the restaurant's frosted windows, he ran his hand across the edge of the linen-covered surface, slowly, as if touching a memory. He didn't look up when the young hostess nervously asked if he needed anything. Instead, he spoke, softly, not just to her, but to the room. "I've been here before," he said, "not as a man in a suit or with a title. I was 9, hungry, cold. My mother had saved up enough for one warm meal, and we came here, right here, to this place." His fingers paused on a faint chip in the table's polish. "We weren't seated. We were told the kitchen was closed, even though it wasn't. We sat outside on the curb eating the sandwich she brought in her bag. A hush swept through the restaurant like a wave pulling back from shore." Elijah finally looked up. "I told myself then I'd come back here one day, not for revenge, but to reclaim the moment, to rewrite it, with grace." He smiled, but it was tinged with the ache of someone who had waited a lifetime to turn pain into peace. "So I waited. I built. I gave. And a few months ago, I bought into the restaurant's parent company, became majority investor." The room stilled. Utensils gently clinked back onto plates. Olivia's hand flew to her mouth. Martin stared, stunned into silence. Elijah's voice dropped just enough to draw every ear toward him. "I didn't come here to be served. I came to see if the place had changed." He paused. "Turns out only the paint has." A couple of diners nearby stood awkwardly and left, eyes downcast, as if they too had been complicit in letting silence do harm. Others shifted in their seats, unsure how to reconcile fine wine with truth spoken so plainly. Elijah glanced out the window, the last hint of daylight fading into dusk. Then, turning back to the room, he said, "This table isn't just mine. It's for every child who was once told they didn't belong, for every hungry mother forced to feed her kid outside, for everyone who was made to feel invisible in a place built for show, not soul." He leaned back, not smug, not proud, just grounded in something far deeper than ownership. It wasn't about power. It was about place. And in that moment, Elijah didn't just reclaim a table, he reclaimed history. Within a single day, the restaurant's parent company, now under intense scrutiny, released a formal statement acknowledging the incident and launching an internal review. Martin and Olivia were placed on indefinite suspension, not just for their behavior, but for violating the very standard of excellence the establishment claimed to represent. But Elijah King, true to the essence of who he was, didn't call for vengeance. He didn't demand their firing, nor did he revel in the public backlash. Instead, he asked for something deeper, more lasting. This isn't about two people, he told the board. It's about a culture that made them feel justified. With the full weight of his influence as majority investor, Elijah enacted sweeping changes to the restaurant's mission. The first was the implementation of a full-scale service overhaul. Mandatory empathy training, anti-bias workshops, and historical literacy seminars were introduced for every member of staff, from the dishwashers to the maitre d'. Every training began with one sentence printed on the first slide. Dignity is the first course. But Elijah didn't stop there. He reached back, as he always had, to uplift others. Partnering with local nonprofits and culinary schools, Elijah launched a new initiative, the Evelyn Project, named after his late wife. It was a mentorship and scholarship program for underprivileged youth aimed at opening doors into the culinary and hospitality industries. The program included job placements, training, financial aid, and, most importantly, direct experience, at the very restaurant that had once denied a hungry little boy and his mother a seat. Let this place become a table where everyone is taught to serve, and everyone is taught they belong, Elijah said during the initiative's announcement. His words weren't written by publicists. They flowed from a life lived in truth, molded by wounds stitched together with grace. The story went viral almost overnight. Footage of Elijah's calm confrontation at the table, his refusal to be moved by arrogance, his poetic words delivered with quiet steel, was shared across platforms, reaching millions. News anchors praised his composure. Activists called it a masterclass in reclaiming space with honor. Celebrities reposted his speech with captions like, "Real power looks like this." But Elijah remained elusive from the limelight. He declined television appearances, interviews, and panel invitations. "I didn't do this to go viral," he told his board in a closed meeting. "I did this because no one else should have to carry that kind of memory." Weeks later, the restaurant reopened under its new training protocols. A community celebration was planned, this time in Elijah's honor. Invitations were sent to local leaders, civil rights activists, former staff from his early foundations, and even former critics. The energy that night was different, not one of luxury, but of gratitude. The lights glowed softer. The staff moved with new attentiveness, not because they feared the consequences, but because they had been shown the meaning of service beyond silverware. Elijah arrived as he always did, unannounced, no security detail, dressed in a freshly pressed white shirt, his trusted denim jacket, and that same worn leather watch ticking gently on his wrist. He walked past the private rooms prepared for him and instead returned to the same table by the window, the same one where he had once sat in silence. But this time, it wasn't empty. Across from him, beside the other place setting, he gently placed a small framed photograph of Evelyn. She was smiling, radiant, caught in a moment from years ago, laughing under sunlight at a picnic they once shared. That photo held all the warmth of his life's journey, the battles, the victories, the love that kept him grounded. The restaurant staff gave him space, but they watched with reverence. He wasn't just a guest anymore. He was the soul of the room. Throughout the evening, people approached him, not out of obligation, but with sincerity. A young black waitress thanked him tearfully. She had been offered a scholarship through the Evelyn Project. A Latino dishwasher handed him a handwritten note, thanking him for making a place where people like us aren't invisible. Even the new manager bowed slightly when refilling his water, not out of fear, but respect. And, for once, Elijah accepted it without resistance. He knew this moment didn't erase the past, but it rewrote what the future could be. He dined slowly, savoring each bite, letting memory guide his senses. With every taste, every sip, he wasn't just eating a meal, he was tasting closure. The room buzzed quietly behind him, no longer with whispers of doubt, but with echoes of change. As the night drew to a close, Elijah leaned back in his chair and looked out the window, the city lights shimmering like old dreams reborn. Then, his gaze fell back to Evelyn's photo. He smiled softly, whispered something only she would have understood, and lifted his glass in her direction. He hadn't come back for the food. He came back for the moment that was stolen from him as a boy, and this time, he claimed it with dignity, with love, and with the full force of legacy behind him. He didn't come back for the meal. He came back for the memory. And this time, the world saw him whole. They laughed at his jacket. They didn't realize it covered a legacy. In a world obsessed with appearances, they mistook simplicity for insignificance, denim for defeat, and age for irrelevance. But Elijah King showed us that power doesn't always enter with noise. It sometimes sits silently, watching, waiting, and when the moment is right, it speaks with a grace that turns shame into change. He didn't shout. He didn't retaliate. He simply stood tall in a room that tried to shrink him, and let the truth do the rest. Have you ever been judged by your appearance, only to surprise everyone with who you really are? If Elijah's quiet power moved you, share this story with someone who believes character speaks louder than clothing, and tell us in the comments, what does dignity mean to you? Thanks for watching. Stay with us for more stories where grace walks quietly until it stands tall.